Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. Today I wanted to go into another, I guess, deck tech for TCG Tuesday. I am in the process of building an Umbris Fear Manifest deck, and I wanted to kind of go over some of the cards that I actually have set aside right here, and then just some cards off the top of my head that I'm looking to put into the deck, and kind of the direction that I wanted to take with it. Umbris, you can go a lot of different directions. A lot of people are building it in a Tron sort of way because Umbris can get very large very quickly. So you can Tron with things like Whisper Silk Cloak to make it unblockable and deal an outright 20 commander damage very quickly to eliminate opponents very quickly. I would like to kind of show my direction with it, which is more along the lines of heavy mill, in an attempt to mill out my opponent very quickly. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Keep in mind that yes, this is a deck tech. It's not finished yet. There's still a lot of fine tuning I have to do. There are way more than 100 cards that I wanted to put into this deck, so I have to find the ones that I think best fit and bring down the card count. So what I'm showing you is more along the lines of things that I would like to add to it, but the final list is obviously going to drop heavily a lot of the cards that are sitting in here. So first off, we should look at Umbris Fear Manifest. So Umbris Fear Manifest is 3, a blue and a black, for a 1/1 legendary Nightmare Horror. It gets +1/+1 for each card your opponent owns in exile. So one of the biggest things that you want to do with this deck is exile your opponent's cards ASAP. Things that come to mind are Leyline of the Void, or even Planner Void from Urza Saga. When Umbris or another Nightmare or Horror enters the battlefield under your control, target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a land. That seems like that would be a lot of cards, but honestly, when we're playing Commander and you're playing anywhere from 35 to 38 lands in your deck, you are probably going to hit lands pretty quickly. But him hitting one land just means that he's not going to get out of control very quickly. So just keep that in mind. The more things that are exiled that your opponents own, the bigger that he gets. And since we're not just utilizing his ability to exile cards from graveyards, he'll get out of hand quick enough. So that is Umbris Fear Manifest. And with that being said, obviously we are going to be running a lot of Nightmares and Horrors in here. Specifically, things that I would look at are, Relentless Scourge, or it's the Eldrazi Scourge Horror that can be played while it's in exile. I cannot remember the exact name. I think it's Relentless or something to that effect, Scourge. Or Wharfside... I think it's Wharfside Horror that creates Eldrazi Horrors, because you can create the Eldrazi Horrors to trigger the ability. But those are just things that come to mind. We're going to take a look at what I have here and then talk about some of the other cards that I'd like to add to it. Starting with Windfall. I think Windfall is a really great way to get cards into the graveyard. Because after they get into the graveyard, it's just one more step from there to get them exiled. And if you already have the Planner Void, or you already have the Leyline of the Void in play, any of the cards that are being discarded are just going to get removed anyway. So this is just a great way to add a whole bunch of cards to your opponent's graveyard and possibly get them exiled, to up the power of Umbris. But more importantly, it can also help to get rid of any cards that they might be holding onto that are really good. And if you have a stinky hand, this is a great way to draw a new set of cards and possibly get outside of stinky situation. Next up were control options. We got Negate. Nothing much to say there. Fierce Guardianship, very good card. If your commander's online, this card is free to play and it just counters a non-creature spell. It's not super good in the sense that it can't just counter anything, but still for free to counter a non-creature spell is darn good. We have Didn't Say Please. This one is, for obvious reasons, I'm not just building this to exile a whole bunch of cards, I'm also building it to mill out my opponent. So things like Didn't Say Please or Thought Collapse, that extra mill of 3 cards is just really helpful throughout the course of the game. We have Dissipate, Traumatize. Target player puts the top half of his or her library rounded down into his or her graveyard. Not only, again, if you have Leyline of the Void or Plantar Void in play, does that mean you're exiling a large portion of your opponent's deck, but this actually helps to take out a humongous amount of cards from your opponent's deck. In Commander, it's it's going to be like around 40 something, depending on when you play it. We got Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is just, especially if they're playing a low CMC aggro deck, this could possibly snag quite a few cards before you hit that 20 mana value or more point. So it's just a nice way to mill cards. We got Maddening Cacophony. This one is important because even if it's not kicked, for 2 mana, you're milling 8 cards. But for the kicker cost, so we're paying 4 and 2 blue, you're actually milling half their library just like Traumatize. So for 1 extra mana, you're milling half their library. But the difference being that Traumatize rounds down and Maddening Cacophony actually rounds up. So you're going to catch more cards this way. We got Psychic Corrosion. Whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of the library into the graveyard. So not only is this every turn you draw, you're going to mill 2 cards of your opponents, but anytime you actually draw beyond your first draw, you're going to continue to do so as well. So if you're using Ponder or Opt or anything like that, those draws will also affect your opponent. We're running Ruin Crab. One of the things on my list is Hedron Crab. I don't actually own one. I'm pretty sure I accidentally sold mine off. So Ruin Crab and Hedron Crab are both landfall mill 3 cards. So for 1 blue, a 0/3 landfall mill 3 cards, just a nice way to force your opponent to use spot removal on cards that are suboptimal. Otherwise they get milled to death. We have Raven Form as spot removal, Resculpt for spot removal. Thassa Deep Dwelling is in here for recursion. It will blink out horrors or nightmares that have ETB effects, such as Ravenous Chupacabra, to help you keep spot removal on the table. But also the most important part is that those creatures are going to, those horrors and nightmares are going to pop back into play, and when they do so, they will trigger Umbris Sphere Manifest, which means more cards being exiled from your opponent's library. Reflections of Litjara. This one, it is obviously really good for this deck if you call Horror or Nightmare, because you get to copy the spell, so it's just a double trigger of ETB effects. So it's I'm having a hard time finding a reason not to put this in my deck, I should say. Arcane Adaptation is really important because it is going to turn everything in your deck into whatever you call Nightmare, Horror, whatever it is that you choose as far as a creature type, which is really important for Umbris triggers because you're not just running only Nightmares and Horrors. There are a lot of really good cards in that are available in the blue-black colors that mill, that are also creatures that are outside the Nightmare Horror tag. And so this will help you to trigger your Umbris while still getting the mill effects from those creatures. Propaganda, for obvious reasons, mitigate attacks. As the game goes on longer, this becomes more useless. We have Sludge Monster because of slime counters. So Sludge Monster not only puts slime counters on non-horror creatures, so it has less of an effect on you, which turns those creatures into a base power and toughness of 2/2, which is super effective against really big beaters on your opponent's side. But they also will combo with Toxrill, who is also in here. More importantly, it's a horror, so it's going to trigger Umbris's effect. Then we have Mind Flayer. Mind Flayer is just a good way to spot remove in a sense that you gain control of a creature. So if you want to take one of their big beaters, this is the way to do it. And again, it's a horror, so it's going to trigger Umbris. We have Grazilax, Illithid Scholar. It is a horror, so it's going to trigger Umbris. And whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you can return it to the owner's hand. So this is a great way for recursion. If you want to swing something back into your hand that has a really good ETB effect, again, I use Ravenous Chupacabra as an example. Not only are you going to pop it back into your hand and replay it at some point in time, you will probably trigger Umbris's effect at that point. So it's just a really cool way to get your horrors and nightmares back into your hand and replay them, not just for the ETB effects. More importantly, whenever one or more of your creatures deal combat damage to a player, you get to draw cards. So again, with the Mind Erosion, or I don't remember exactly what it was called, but it'll trigger the Mind Erosion, milling your opponent for 2 cards. So it's just a really very good card. Hullbreaker Horror is just a really, really good horror. So it triggers Umbris, it has flash, it cannot be countered, and whenever you cast a spell, you can choose to return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So you're going to bounce their biggest threats. And during your opponent's turn, you could potentially use that to pop problem spells back to their hand and force them to either recast it or rethink their turn. Just a very cool card. Overcharged Amalgam, also flash flying. This one has exploit. We're going to have tons of slugs and other types of token creatures in this deck. So exploit's not going to be a hard cost to pay. And when it does exploit, you can counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. So you basically can snuff out something that is a problem at some point in time, even if it's just temporary one-turn fix. Spark Double is to copy, obviously. There are a lot of utility reasons for this, but Spark Double is kind of obvious. Then we got Shadowkin. Shadowkin mills, and on top of that, copies. And it can copy horrors and nightmares, which means it can trigger. So it's just, in a full package, just a very good card. Animate Dead. We're going to be milling our opponents, and prior to the possibility of exile in their graveyards, you have a chance to animate something from their graveyard that is phenomenal. So this is just a good way to get something out of their graveyard that and under control in your field that may be super, super good. So that's just something to keep your mind on when you do it. Although you should be pushing as often as possible to exile your opponent's graveyard just to make Umbris bigger. We have Kaya's Ghost Form. This is part of the Tron mechanic here, because what we're trying to do is keep Umbris on the field. So you want to put this on Umbris just to make sure that he does not die. And this is just one more chance that he does not die. Leyline of the Void, for obvious reasons. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it. I prefer this over Planar Void because this one only targets opponents, and I would like to keep my cards out of exile for other reasons. Specifically, I have the Consuming Aberration, I believe it is. It gets power and toughness equal to the number of creatures I control in my graveyard, and so the more things that I have unexiled in my graveyard, the more powerful that aberration becomes. So Planar Void is more useful to me in the sense of getting rid of my opponent's graveyards. Go Blank. It exiles all cards from a player's graveyard. So this is just, if Planar Void's not, Leyline of the Void is not in play, we have Go Blank and quite a few other cards to help get rid of the opponent's graveyard. On top of that, the target player discards 2 cards, so you're controlling their hand as well as getting rid of their graveyard. Demonic Tutor for tutor reasons. Feed the Swarm for spot removal. Extinction Event is one of a couple of the board wipes that I've put into this deck. They're not, the board wipes that I've chosen aren't like the top tier optimal board wipes. There's no Damnation in this deck. I did not put Toxic Deluge in here or Meat Hook Massacre, just simply because of the cost. but the ones that I put in here I think make sense for the deck. One of them is going to be Living Death, because you're going to spend your entire time exiling your opponent's graveyards. So by the time you actually play Living Death, they're probably going to get zero or very little benefit from it, whereas you will probably receive a large benefit from playing it. Life's Finale is another one of those. Destroy all creatures and search target player's library for up to 3 creature cards and put them into his or her graveyard. Then that player shuffles. This one is in an attempt to not only thin out the opponent's library because we're milling them, but also to try and pull out some of those power creatures before they have a chance to get it, and hopefully exile them before they have a chance to do anything with it. Szat's Will. This one has a lot of utility. It's spot removal. Not to mention you can create 0/1 Thrall tokens when you exile your opponent's graveyard, where X is equal to the power of the total power among creature cards exiled this way. So you can get a bunch of 0/1 tokens that can either be used for chump blockers or for sacrifice fodder throughout the course of the deck. It's just a very interesting card. Malika Rebirth. Again, a way to save Umbris. Vampiric Tutor, because it's a tutor. Eat to Exile Extinction is a spot removal, as well as Baleful Mastery. Vraska's Contempt as well. Some of these, like I said, they're not going to make it in. They're just cards that are very good or have good synergy. We have Woe Strider as well. Woe Strider, you can sacrifice, again, for this one, if you have a bunch of those Thrall tokens in play, you can sacrifice those Thrall tokens to scry, so you can help to find the cards that you need quicker. It has an escape, so you can exile cards from your graveyard to put them back into play as a 5/4. And he's a horror, so he's going to trigger Umbris's effect, and just the escape alone helps to re-trigger that effect. So it's just a good card to have in here. We have Nightmare Shepherd. Whenever your creatures do die, they're going to come back as 1/1 nightmares, in addition to their other... they'll have all of their normal ETB effects and all of that stuff, but they come in as nightmares too, which will trigger Umbris. Mage Hunter, it's a horror, so it triggers Umbris, and whenever your opponent casts or copies an instant or sorcery spell, they're going to lose a life, so you're going to punish them for playing spells. Banehound is just a super cheap Nightmare Hound, so it's going to trigger Umbris. It has haste and lifelink, so early game it's a really nice aggressive starter. Granted, early game you're probably not going to trigger Umbris, but it's just a nice starter from the beginning. We have Grim Dancer in here as well, because Grim Dancer is just downright versatile. Not to mention that it's a nightmare. The fact that it can come in with Menace, Death Touch, and Lifelink, 2 of the 3 available options, just makes it very versatile and helps to fit within any situation that you might be in. Phyrexian Rager is a good way to draw cards. You draw a card, lose a life, and it's a horror, so it triggers Umbris. Mind Leecher. The Mind Leecher is a nightmare, so it will trigger Umbris, and then you will probably only likely trigger the mutate ability one time when you play it as a mutation, just because it's the only card in this deck that has mutate. So I don't really know if this guy's going to make it through. It's a great card, but it's not... I just don't see it getting used very often. Ravenous Chupacabra is spot removal, and with all the different ways that you can blink things out or return things back to play, Ravenous Chupacabra is gonna do a lot of work, I think. And it's a horror, so it's gonna trigger Umbris. Opposition Agent. Opposition Agent is something that you should put in most black decks, just because it stops your opponent from being able to search their library, and more importantly allows you to search the library, exile the card completely from their library, and then you can cast it as though it were your own, and as if your mana was any color. So it's just a mean way to stop your opponent from tutoring or ramping, and also give you an incredible benefit. This one might not make it because it's just too mean. We got Falthus Shadowcat Familiar. This is to help to buff your commander, because it gives your commander Menace and Death Touch, which makes him harder to block, and if you do block, you're going to lose whatever you're blocking with, guaranteed. We got Toxrill. Toxrill was the slime counters again. So we have the horror that I showed you earlier, the Sludge Monster, which creates slime counters, and it puts your opponent's creatures that have slime counters on them down to a base power and toughness of 2/2. Any creatures that you don't control that have a slime counter also get -1/-1. So if you have the Sludge Monster in play and you have Toxrill in play, then all of those creatures are now just 1/1s. And basically, whenever a creature you don't control with a slime counter on it dies, you get to create a slug. So it's another type of counter that you can create it's a creature counter that you can sacrifice to do any numerous sack abilities, like in this case, sacrifice a slug to draw a card. We've got the Dothi Voidwalker. Voidwalker is another way to exile cards from your opponent's graveyard, and cards that are exiled with Dothi Voidwalker, you can tap and sacrifice Dothi Voidwalker to choose one of those to play. So if you have a really effective card in your opponent's exiles from Dothi Voidwalker, you can actually, sacrifice him completely to play one of those cards. More importantly, because it's a creature, there's a lot of reanimate in this, so you can reanimate the card, bring it back, and keep doing it. Again, Dothi Voidwalker I'd rather have in here than Planner Void for the same reason, because whenever a card goes into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you can exile it. So it's just a good way to keep your graveyard unexiled while your opponent's graveyards are exiled. We have Hunted Horror. Trample, when it enters the battlefield, put 2 3/3 green centaur tokens with protection from black into play. The reason I like this one is because it only costs 2 for a 7/7, and it's a horror, so it'll trigger Umbris. The 3/3 centaurs with protection from black will likely become a problem unless you find a way to remove them, and that's where things like Reality Shift, Resculpt, or Raven Form come into play. But also, at the same time, they're going to end up getting slime counters and eventually finding death in that form one way or another. So I'm not too worried about the 3/3 centaurs, honestly. Just for a 7/7 for 2 is just too good to pass up, especially if it triggers Umbris. Doom Whisperer, for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, it's a nightmare, so it's going to trigger Umbris. It has flying and trample. It's a 6/6, and you can pay 2 to surveil, so you can start going through your deck trying to find cards that you need to help close out the game, basically. We have Altar of Dementia. Altar of Dementia will not work with the creature tokens, so you are going to have to sacrifice other creatures. Well, I mean, I guess it will. It won't work with the Thralls, because the Thralls they have a power of 0, but if you want to sacrifice slugs, you can sacrifice slugs to mill 1 card. But this one, I think, is more along the lines of when my Umbris is very large and my opponent's deck is starting to get very, very thin. This would be a great way to close out the game by sacrificing Umbris and milling the last couple of cards left in my opponent's deck. Amongst any other reasons, like you can sacrifice some of the, like for instance, the Relentless Scourge is a 3/3 horror. So not only can you bring it back from exile, you can sacrifice it using Altar of Dementia to mill 3 cards, but when it comes back from the exile, Umbris will be triggered, so you're milling more than 3 cards. There's a lot of good possibilities with Altar of Dementia. Maskwood Nexus is up there with Arcane Adaptation, just because it is going to turn everything into basically a nightmare or horror, because they embody all creature types. But more importantly, it can create 2/2 shapeshifters that have Changeling, which means that every time you create those little 2/2 shapeshifters, they're going to trigger Umbris. So I have Soul Guide Lantern in here, as well as Tormod's Crypt and Lantern of the Lost. Like I said, these might not all of these will make it But in these cases, probably most of them, just because Lantern of the Lost, when you sacrifice it, you can exile all cards from all graveyards, then draw a card. Tormod's Crypt, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. And Soul Guide Lantern, you can sack it to exile each opponent's graveyard. So just ways to exile large portions of cards and thus up Umbris's power. Some of the rocks that we'll be doing are Commander Sphere and Mindstone. These are just mana rocks. You should also have Soul Ring and Arcane Signet and so on and so forth. In this case, we're also going to have Talisman of Dominance and Demir's Signet as well. Shadow Spear, just because it's really freaking good. And if you put Urza's Saga in here, you can search out Shadow Spear with Urza's Saga. It gives trample and lifelink. So, you know, Umbris, when he's big, having lifelink and trample is enough to do, well, it can close out a game. More importantly, it can remove hexproof and indestructible from your opponent's permanents. So it's a great way to make them more vulnerable. Then we have Solemn Simulacrum for ramp and draw. As I mentioned earlier, Talus of Dominance. Siphon Insight has flashback, and it exiles cards, although it is a very small exile. You can also play the cards, I believe, that you exile, as long as they remain exiled, and you can use mana as if it was mana of any color to play those spells. So it's a nice way, again, to find those power cards that your opponent has and try and use them against them. This one is one that I was teetering on, and I'm not sure. I do want to use it, and I don't see a lot of other people using it. But when he does, he's got flying, he's a 2/4, and when he does deal damage to a player, that player reveals cards from the top of his or her library until they reveal 4 lands, and then put those cards into his or her library. So this is potentially a very large mill, because we're not just looking for 1 land at this point, we're looking for 4 lands. And I can't imagine that. I mean, that feels like it's going to be a 10-card mill at minimum a lot of the time. I feel like. I could be very wrong about that, but I think he has big mill swings with him. So I really like him in this deck. And not to mention, with the Maskwood Nexus or the Arcane Adaptation, he would count as a horror or a nightmare, thus proccing or triggering Umbris's effect. We have Whispering Madness. Whispering Madness is a lot like Windfall, where each player discards their hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards discarded this way. So we're getting a lot of cards thrown into the graveyard. And again, if Dothi Voidwalker or Leyline of the Void are in play, then these cards are getting exiled. More importantly, though, it has Cipher, so you can attach it to something that you know is going to attack and deal damage, and copy the spell every time you attack with it and deal damage, which means that your opponents are just constantly milling through the cards in their hand, which is just as effective as milling off the top of their deck, because they're going to be drawing cards back up as well. So I think it's an auto include. We got Phoenix, God of Deception. Each creature I control is going to get the ability to tap it, and then target player puts the top X cards from his library into his graveyard, where X is the creature's toughness. So some of these, it's not going to be that big. But again, Umbris, like I said, is at one point in time going to get very large. And tapping Umbris to get that final mill is just a really great thing. And Phoenix isn't indestructible, so they're going to have to find a way to get him off the field, not to mention a toughness of 7 when he is a creature. Rogue class, because it mills, and it's just a darn good enchantment. King Narfi, or King Narfi's Betrayal, because it mills. And, of course, you can spend mana of any color to play the cards that you mill with King Narfi's Betrayal. Counter Squall. Drown on the Lock for control, and because you're going to have a lot of cards in your graveyard. Oblivion Sower is amongst, I think, 3 Eldrazi that are going to be in here. Sire of Stagnation, and what was the last one? I don't remember the other one, but Sire's Stagnation is in there as well. And Oblivion Sower exiles 4 cards from their library, and then you can put any number of lands that were exiled that way onto the battlefield under your control. So it's like Ramp, only it hurts your opponent. How can you go wrong with that? Not to mention it exiles cards. So the 4 cards, if none of them were lands, you just exiled 4 cards successfully, which makes Umbris even bigger. Ashiok has 4 forms, and I'm fighting myself to put all 4 in here, but this one for sure, it shuts out search just like Opposition Agent does. Opposition Agent gives you a much more beneficial effect, whereas obviously Ashiok Dream Render is just shuts it out completely. It's mean, but kind of necessary, I guess. It's just mean. We have also Ashiok Sculptor of Fears. This one probably won't make it, especially considering the Nightmare, the one from Theros Beyond Death is just better. It creates nightmares, so it'll trigger Umbris that when they attack, mill your opponent's deck. So they literally do everything that I want from this deck, basically. So that other Ashiok is much, much more likely to be in there. Now, among some of the cards that we're going to be also very likely including in this that I don't currently have right now that I will be purchasing are things like Raven Guildmaster. Raven Guildmaster just mills such a heavy amount of cards whenever it attacks that I feel like it's got to be in here. And that goes up there with Nemesis of Reason as well, because Nemesis of Reason is either a horror or a nightmare, one of the two. So not only is it going to trigger Umbris, but it also mills a heavy number of cards from your opponent. We also are putting in Una, Queen of the Fairies, because it also mills heavy numbers of cards. Some of the instants and sorceries / enchantments that I wanted to put in here are things like Mind Funeral, Mind Grind, and Mind Crank, because they are all extremely heavy mills. We also are putting in things like Crumbling Sanctuary. Crumbling Sanctuary basically says that whenever you deal combat, whenever whoever has Crumbling Sanctuary in play deals combat damage with the creature, instead of dealing damage, you just simply mill your opponent's library for cards equal to the number of, or equal to the amount of damage you dealt. So we're going to switch out from dealing damage to just simply milling your opponent, which is incredibly painful for your opponent. We have Court of Cunning in there. Court of Cunning as an enchantment, I think it's every upkeep, mills your opponent, but it also makes you the monarch. So as long as you remain the monarch, Court of Cunning's mill is much, much worse. What else did I add in there? Crumbling Sanctuary. Oh, Drown in Dreams. Drown in Dreams can be a potential game ender. Because if their library has been milled enough, you can just simply force them to draw X cards to the point of losing the game. And then one of the ones that I think that is extremely important for this deck is Startled Awake. It's a blue card that transforms. In its Startled Awake form, it mills your opponent, and in its transformed form, it is a nightmare, so it can trigger Umbris, and it returns itself to your hand, so you can replay it as Startled Awake, which mills your opponent. So it's just downright an incredibly good card, not only for mill, but also for triggering Umbris. We also have the land base. This is only the ones that I actually have. I still have to purchase quite a few of them, but we're running, obviously, the Islands and Swamps. Evolving Wilds, Fabled Passage, Temple of the False God, Castle Locktwain for options, Castle Ventress, I guess to Scry for more options. Mystic Sanctuary, this is a great way to get things like, shoot, I think it can target, it says instant or sorcery, so like Maddening Cacophony, shoot, what was the other one? Traumatize. Cards like that back into your hand, so you can do Tasha's Hideous Laughter, so you can do some pretty heavy mill. Ice Tunnel counts as an island swamp. It's a Snowland. Enters play tapped. It's in here because it counts as an island swamp. Drowned Catacomb, Dismal Backwater, Command Beacon, Field of Ruin, Exotic Orchard, Hostile. Hostile, I believe, exiles cards from your graveyard. Doesn't matter. Still, Hostile is a nice card to have in here because it's just a big mean card. Reliquary Tower, just in case you draw lots of cards. You should be. Temple of Deceit for obvious reasons. Watery Grave. Sunken Hollow. Shipwreck Marsh. So yeah, that is my deck tech for Umbris. There's quite a few other cards that I don't have, and once I have the deck more completed, I will post a list of cards that I put in it. Like I said, I didn't want to build this as a Tron deck. I wanted to build this as a strictly mill. So we're looking for heavy mill options, and yeah. So that's it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. I will be removing any toxic or just mean comments. There's no need for those. Let's keep it classy. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. And if you feel the need to support me, check me out on my Patreon under the same name, Uncommon Ramen. I do all this in my free time, so any amount of support that I can get will help me bring more of this content to you. And guys, until next time, peace.